Len attended the University of Rochester, where he got his BA and MBA. He and Suzanne moved to Chicago in 1974, where she attended law school, and he went to work for the U.S. Gypsum Company. He left Gypsum in 1989 to go into business with his brother-in-law, running an engine remanufacturing company in Phoenix, Arizona. They operated that business for 15 years and closed it down in 2004. After years of commuting back and forth between Chicago and Phoenix, Len turned his attention to writing and competing in triathlons. His first novel, American Pastime, was published in April 2014. It was described by Kirkus Reviews as a well-crafted novel and darkly nostalgic study of an American family through good times and bad. Pamela Irwin's another writer and critic. She wrote that, and here's the part I like. It says, Len Joy has an eye for the humble, uttering convincing details of family life. This is America seen neither through the gauze of nostalgia nor with easy cynicism, but rather with a clear-eyed tenderness. He is nationally ranked age group triathlete and is a member of Team USA, which represents the USA in international triathlon. Today he is going to talk to us about his dual journey in the talk entitled, Life is a Journey, Not a Destination. Len?
Okay, I think I'm ready. Thank you very much, Glenn. I'm thrilled to be here today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the North Shore Senior Center Tuesday program. I have an alternate title for my talk. It's called How to Write a Novel. It's true, I've only published this one novel, American Pastime, available in someplace. But I wrote that novel 6 times, and it took me nearly 10 years, so I have more experience than it might appear. Obviously, there's no universally accepted way to write a book. Every writer has to come up with a process that works best for them. Now, I start with an opening. When I start a story, the first thing I do is come up with the title for what I'm going to write. Even though that often changes, having that title gives me the footing so that I can push off and get the story developed. And what you need is a good opening. And I don't think you have to have a grab the reader by the throat opening to succeed, but you really have to avoid having a bad opening, because that will kill you. I'll give you an example. The Chicago Cubs, for years, had a tradition of inviting celebrities to lead the singing of the Take Me Out to the Ball game in the 7th inning. And a while back, the Tribune had one of those readers' surveys where they asked the readers to rate the speakers over the last decade. I don't remember who was the best, but the runaway loser was NASCAR driver Jeff Gordon. Gordon's remembered unfondly by Cubs fans because when they introduced him, he told the crowd how thrilled he was to be in, I'll give you a little prop here.
Fenway Park.
He's looking at this sign and he says, I'm thrilled to be in Wrigley Stadium. After that, it didn't matter how he performed. Now, for me, the most important part of building as a building block is the scene. Sandra Schofield, who I took several courses with, and she wrote this book called the Scene Book. It's a great book for aspiring writers. She writes, the scene is the most vivid and immediate part of the story. It is a scene that a writer captures the heart and imagination of the reader. It is a scene that leaves the reader with images and a memory of the action. Okay, here's a scene. A boy walks across the University Quadrangle on the first nice day of spring after a long, brutal winter. The date is May 4th, 1970. He is a freshman. There are a bunch of students tossing a frisbee. One of them is an Asian girl with long flowing hair and a beautiful smile. He knows her name because he knows the names of all the pretty freshman girls. She hurls the frisbee in his direction and calls out his name. Catch it, she yells. He's surprised she knows his name. He joins the group. The girl asks him if he's going to the dance tomorrow. She tells him that Ferguson, Davis, and Jones, who have a top 40 single, are playing in the Hill Lounge. The boy does not like to dance. He has never heard of Ferguson, Davis, and Jones. He is not aware of the dance. Of course, he says, you want to go with me? She grins like she knows something. Sure, she says, I'm in Lovejoy 114. Pick me up at 8? Okay, that's a classic boy meets girl opening scene. I think it has a memorable image, that frisbee gliding across the quad as the cute girl calls out the boy's name. Why did the writer provide the date? Does anyone know what happened on May 4th, 1970?
Got married.
Kent State. There were campus protests over the revelation of the secret bombing of the Viet Cong safe havens in Cambodia. At Kent State, the governor called out the Ohio National Guard, and in an inexplicable tragedy, 4 students were shot and killed by soldiers. Young people protesting the war shot by young people in the Guard to avoid being drafted. The news reverberated across campuses. At the boys' school, classes are canceled and a student rally is called for the next day. Okay, here is the next scene in this story. A poker game is underway in Gilbert, the freshman dorm. There are 5 players seated at the table. The boy, who is a regular in the game, is watching. One of the players pats the empty chair next to him and beckons the boy. Sit down, we need 6. The boy tells him he can't play. He's going to the dance with the girl he met yesterday. Conversation at the table halts immediately. They know the girl. She is cute and popular. They know the boy has not had a date all year. Neither have any of them, except George. Are you crazy? George asked. No one will be at that dance. Everyone will be at the rally. It will be a dating disaster. The boy senses that George is right. He imagines an empty dance floor with no other couples around to hide his lack of dance skill. Just tell her you can't go tonight. She'll give you another chance. The boy senses that George is wrong. He's pretty certain if he doesn't show up at Lovejoy 114 in 10 minutes, the girl will not give him another chance. Have a good game, guys. I'm going to the dance. Okay, the memorable image here is the poker table with an empty chair and 5 poker players who have suddenly stopped talking. How does this story end? They go to the dance. Turns out George is right. There are only 3 couples there, and they are all great dancers. The girl says, let's go to the rally. They stroll over to the student union where the rally is underway. After the speeches, they walk from the union to the hill, to the towers, to the phase, over to the library. Finally, hours later, they head back to the dorms. The girl is funny and smart and easy to talk to. She is interested in him and what he thinks and does. When they arrive at the door of her dorm room, the girl smiles and tells him she had a very good time. He kisses her. It is a really good kiss. 3 years, 7 months, and 24 days later, my next drop, they're married. Thank you. Got the right one? They raised 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. 44 years later, they are still married. I'll return to that boy later. Getting started. How does someone start a novel? Some writers have a story they want to share. Maybe it's a semi-true based on something that happened to them, someone they knew. Other writers start with just a fragment, an overheard conversation, an intriguing character they encountered. My novel started with an image. I was driving home on Interstate 80 from the Iowa Writers Festival. It was my first week-long writer workshop. My brain was exploding with writerly stuff. Point of view, story arc, punctuation rules. I'm heading east back to Evanston, and in the westbound lane, there has been an accident. Both lanes are blocked. Traffic is backed up for miles. A mile beyond the snarl, westbound cars are still racing down the highway, unaware of what lies ahead. A man and his wife cruise by in a blue Plymouth Belvedere. I only see them for an instant, but that image stays with me. The man is smiling, talking to his wife, not a care in the world. He doesn't know what's up ahead, how his day is going to get a whole lot less good. Soon, after I returned home from that workshop, my niece wrote and asked me if I would write a story to be read at her wedding in September. I was honored, but I instinctively knew that even if I were to write a short story as good as Raymond Carver or Alice Munro, reading a story at a wedding reception would be a disaster. I finally convinced her of that, but not before I had written a 1,000-word story called The Toast. The Toast begins with a man driving his family down the highway. I kept working on it, and a couple years later, I had an epic 50-year, multi-generational saga. Call it American Pastime 1.0. I had no idea where I was going with that image when I started. I didn't know I was writing a novel. It seems like a crazy way to create something, but there are some pluses to not knowing exactly where your story is headed. You have the opportunity to be surprised. Robert Boswell, in his book, The Half-Known World, another instructor I took a course from, he writes that to make something fully known is to make it unreal, Boswell writes. Think of Disneyland. Think of the speeches of politicians. Think of McDonald's. The fast food goal is not to give you great food, but to give you exactly what you expect. Nothing from my original story, The Toast, survived except for the image of the man driving his family on the highway. Here is how American Pastime opens. September 5th, 1953. Dancer Stonemason drove through Maple Springs, headed for Rolla. His left hand rested gentle on the steering wheel, and in his pitching hand he held a baseball, loose and easy, like he was shooting craps. The ball took the edge off the queasy feeling he got on game days. His son Clayton sat beside him and made sputtering engine noises as he gripped an imaginary steering wheel, while Dee Dee, Dancer's wife, stared out the window with other things on her mind. Christopher Vogler in The Writer's Journey talks about the hero's call to adventure. He says, some event is necessary to get a story rolling, once the main character is introduced. The call to adventure may come in the form of a message or a messenger. Okay, my opening introduces the main character, Dancer Stonemason, and his wife, Dee Dee, and his young son, Clayton. What happens next? Well, Dancer is the star pitcher for this minor league AAA team, the Rolla Rebels. It's the weekend before Labor Day, and Dancer hopes he will soon be promoted to the majors to pitch for the St. Louis Cardinals. That has been his dream since he was 7 years old, and his father took him to St. Louis to watch Dizzy Dean pitch. When he arrives at the park, his manager, Doc Evans, the messenger, tells him they need to talk. I had a call from Mr. Stanky this morning. Doc pulled out a cigar and sniffed it up and down. He acted as if the Cardinal manager called him every day. Haddix has a sore arm. They're thinking about shutting him down. Cards ain't going nowhere. Doc bit off the end of the cigar. Dancer crept to the edge of his chair. Doc could spend 10 minutes farting around with his goddamn cigars. So? Dancer asked, his voice breaking. So they might need you for the Labor Day doubleheader Monday. Dancer jumped up. The Cardinals. His spikes almost slipped out from under him, and he had to grab Doc's desk to keep from falling. Try not to kill yourself before you get there, son. Dancer sat back in his seat. But I'm still pitching today, right? My boy's out there. He's counting on me. Doc cocked his head to one side. I can't send you up to St. Louis with your arm dragging around your ankles. He puffed harder on the cigar. Tell you what, you can go 3 innings. That'll keep you fresh enough so you can still pitch in 2 days. Again, from Vogler's The Journey. Heroes come to decision points where their very souls are at stake, where they must decide, do I go on living as I always have, or will I risk everything to grow and change? This is one of those days where everything seems to fall in place. Dancer is about to realize his life's ambition to play for the Cardinals. His son is in the crowd cheering him on, and his pitching is magical. Dancer cruised through the 2nd and 3rd innings without a ball hit out of the infield. He was in a groove, his fastball overpowering, his curveball buckling the batter's knees. As he jogged toward the dugout at the end of the 3rd inning, he spotted Clayton jumping up and down on his seat, waving his cap. Dancer had thrown only 40 pitches. A couple more innings wouldn't tire him out. Doc greeted him as he returned to the dugout. "Nice work, son. Bullpen can take it from here." "Don't take me out. I haven't even broke a sweat," Dancer says. "I got plenty left." Doc sighed. "What do you think, Billy?" Billy was taking off his shin guards. Dancer sat down next to him. "Can't stop with a perfect game going. That's not respecting the game." Billy shrugged and glanced over at Doc. "Not my call, Skip. That's why you get the captain's pay." He went back to unhitching his shin guards. Doc stood up and pointed his finger at Dancer. "As soon as they get a hit, I'm taking you out." So Dancer stays in the game, and that decision changes the arc of his life. That impulsive decision is what launches the novel. All right, let's return to the boy. Here's a flashback to his early days. The boy grows up in a red ranch house across the street from the high school football field of the Canandaigua Academy Braves. He has 3 sisters. They're nice, but not much fun to play with. He spends hours in his basement bouncing a red rubber ball against the wall. Many, many hours. He develops great hands. When he plays sandlot football with his friends, it is understood that he is the receiver. He can catch any ball thrown to him. He dreams of the day when he will play for the Braves. He imagines catching long passes and running clear for a touchdown. When he is a sophomore, he is brought up from the JV team to back up the varsity wide receiver. Late in the 4th quarter, the coach finally puts him in the game. His father is in the stands with his brand new Super 8 movie camera waiting for this moment. And I've been waiting for. Let's see if it works. It's the play he's dreamed about for years, except he was supposed to score. When he's tackled on the 13-yard line, he's the most surprised person in the stadium. Still, it's a cool way to start his high school career, and like Charles Dickens' Pip, the boy believes he has great expectations, at least as far as football is concerned. But it turns out that catch is a high water mark of his high school football career. Maybe if he had scored on that play, life would have turned out differently. He might have been discovered and gone to a school with a serious football program. But instead, he goes to the University of Rochester with a bee for a mascot and meets the girl with the Frisbee. Okay, enough about that boy. Let's talk about theme. When I set out to write American Pastime, I didn't have a theme in mind. I'm wary of themes. But I did have a certain notion. I don't know what else to call it. When we watch the Olympics or the World Series or the Super Bowl, we all see these young folks celebrated for their accomplishments. But for everyone on the podium, there are hundreds, maybe thousands, who have the same dream, but because of bad luck or because they just weren't quite good enough, they don't realize their dream. So what happens to the hometown hero after the cheering stops? In American Pastime, Dancer is struggling with his career. He knows in his gut that he is never going to make it to the majors, but it is hard for him to let go. So in this next scene, happens 3 years after his perfect game, and he's now just a relief pitcher hanging on with the minor league team. 3 years, it seemed like a lifetime. The whole world had been out there waiting for him back then. Some folks believed that if he'd walked off that mound after 3 innings, he'd have gotten his chance and he'd be in high cotton now. But he couldn't have done that. A ball player doesn't walk away from a perfect game. Dancer rubbed his arm. The soreness was never going away. He loved baseball. Some days he couldn't hardly believe he was getting paid to do something he loved so much. If it had been possible, he would have played for free, but he had a family to support. He could hang on, try to scratch out a living for a few more years, but that would just make things worse for Dee Dee and the boys. It was time to let go. He pounded the ball into his glove and glanced at each of the runners. He dug his nails into the seams and went into his windup. The ball floated toward the batter, waist high, begging to be slammed. Dancer could see Shepard's eyes get wide and the muscles in his forearm tighten as he stepped into the pitch. But just as Shepard was about to make contact, the ball dropped sharply, clipping the front of the plate and bouncing into the catcher's glove. Shepard corkscrewed himself into the ground, striking out to end the game. As Dancer headed for the locker room, the crowd was on its feet, cheering. He stopped at home plate and looked up as the cheers blanketed him. He doffed his cap, not boastfully, but to show respect for the game. His heart ached. Let's talk a little about historical events. I had the opportunity last summer to attend a book club discussion of American pastime. You know, it was fun to hear people discussing my characters and arguing what they might do or not do. And one of the younger readers asked me if it was more difficult to write historical fiction because of all the research involved. And my first reaction is, what are you talking about? This isn't historical. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I'm not historical. But I have come to realize that for a large share of the reading population, even the Vietnam War is distant history. It was clearly a tumultuous time to grow up. The civil rights movement, the boycotts, the freedom riders, the March on Washington, those were all vivid memories from my youth. The assassinations, President Kennedy in 1963, Malcolm X in 65, and then in the spring of 68, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy killed in a 2-month span. And throughout the 60s and early 70s, there was the war in Vietnam. I was number 343 in the second draft lottery. It's the only lottery I've ever won. This era wasn't all protest and violence. We had the space program. Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn were names that didn't require labels. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon July 29, 1969, 7 weeks after I graduated from high school. The whole nation was watching. I used that event in a scene with Dee Dee and her Dancer's wife and her son Jimmy, who was captivated by the space program. Suddenly, the scene on the TV screen switched from the control room to a grainy black and white image of a man in a spacesuit descending slowly from a ladder. "How did they get the camera up there?" Dee Dee asked. Jimmy slipped off the couch and scooted up close to the television. Camera was attached to an equipment pallet on the side of the lunar module. It unfolded when Neil Armstrong stepped down the ladder. "This is so cool." The astronaut, a white blob with a backpack, stood on the bottom rung of the ladder and put his foot down several times, like a man testing the water temperature in the pool. Finally, he slow motion jumped off the ladder. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Jimmy stood up and clapped. "They did it!" Dee Dee jumped up and clapped too. She took hold of Jimmy's hand and squeezed it hard. Tears were running down her cheeks. "Do you think you'll fly to the moon someday, Mom?" Dee Dee smiled. "I think you'll have to go for me." So that was my history, and while obviously I was not a part of any of those events, they clearly shaped my life. Now, I wanted to talk a little about writing style and workshop comments, and I'll start this by saying that, when I went off to college, I had 2 goals, which I reflect in this picture here. One was to play professional football. I saw myself, this is Fred Bolitnikoff, I don't know if anybody remembers him, but he was a guy about my size that played professional football, so he was a role model. And the other guy was Ernest Hemingway. So my football dream didn't last long. Despite those marvelous hands, I was put on the kickoff team. My job was to run down the field and hurl my body at the wedge of blockers. I was a skinny kid, and the coaches didn't expect me to knock anyone down. They just hoped I would distract the blockers so the guys who knew how to tackle could swoop in unimpeded and grab the ball carrier. I wasn't very good at it. By my junior year, I was in the stands cheering for the team. My other dream didn't survive either. I chose to be an English major my first year, as that seemed the appropriate launching pad to become a world-famous author. But in the second semester of my first year, a few weeks before I encountered that Frisbee, I received an excoriating critique from my early American literature professor on my term paper. I was devastated. I decided I wasn't destined to write the great American novel, and I changed my major to economics. After graduation and a decade in the corporate world, I went into business for myself. For 15 years, I owned and operated an engine remanufacturing company. I commuted between Chicago and Phoenix, logging over 1 million air miles. And on those long flights, I would read literary magazines and novels, and sometimes I would write poems and short stories about people I encountered. In the fall of 2003, I wound the business down. I realized if I wanted to become a writer, I needed to stop wishing it would happen and do something about it. So I began taking writing courses at the University of Chicago's Graham School and attending summer writing workshops. Over the next several years, I participated in workshops at Iowa, Tin House, Squaw Valley, Skidmore, Norman Mailer, Sewanee, and Breadloaf. Workshops, at least for me, were a valuable tool in my development. I think my years in business, dealing with the unvarnished opinions of customers and employees, helped me to learn how to deal with literary criticism. Even myopic, ignorant, and snarky comments can have some benefit. You just have to have a really good filter. Take what's useful, discard the rest. And don't try to satisfy everyone, and ignore the prescriptions. But try to understand what is causing the reader to suggest a solution. What I often encountered in my early drafts was a desire by readers who understand what Dancer, my main character, was thinking. Why doesn't he share his feelings more, they would ask. And while all of these characters are 100% fictional, I can say I empathize with Dancer's unwillingness to share. But I couldn't ignore an issue that was brought up so frequently. So in later drafts, I tried to get Dancer to share more of his thoughts, but mostly I tried to convey his feelings through his actions. And for example, here is a scene where Dancer has a confrontation with Brandon Thacker, who has been trying unsuccessfully to get Dancer to join the Klan. This is after he's left baseball. Dancer has gone to work at the Caterpillar factory in the foundry. It was nearly 4 years when Dancer finally finished his pour and made it back to the locker room. The room smelled of Lysol, sulfur, sweat, and piss. In the middle of the floor was a large circular steel sink with a foot pedal to turn on the water. Brandon Thacker huddled in front of the sink, talking with a couple of his Klan buddies. Dancer stepped around them, leaned into the sink, and stuck his head under the ring of water. "Ah, Stone Mission, don't wash it off. You look just like one of those bug-eyed Negro children down there in Alabama." Dancer shook the water out of his eyes. He was tired. Tired of the job, tired of all the Klan bullshit, tired of Brandon Thacker. With rattlesnake quickness, he grabbed Brandon by the throat and pulled his face under the ring of water. Brandon sputtered and flailed, but Dancer had a steel grip. The men laughed at first, but when he didn't let go, the laughter faded. The locker room became silent except for Thacker's frantic gasps. No one made a move to stop him. Dancer felt strong. He was in charge again. He tightened his grip on Thacker's throat. It would be so easy with just a little more pressure to crush his windpipe. Thacker's face turned purple as he ineffectually clawed at Dancer's hands. Kelly came up next to Dancer and squeezed his shoulder. "Boss man ain't gonna like you drowning his boy." "He doesn't like me anyway," Dancer said. He stared down at Thacker and jerked him out of the sink and set him back on his feet. Brandon wobbled but stayed upright. So I think in this case, Dancer's feelings are pretty clear through his actions. For years, I was a recreational runner. About the same time I started taking those writing courses, I began training at a local triathlon club. The two activities, writing and triathlon training, complement each other. They both require discipline, a willingness to stay the course. And both, at least for most people, require professional training. You don't know what you don't know. I always believed that to become a better runner, I needed to run more. Run every day, run harder, push my body. But when I started training with professionals, I learned to run smarter, have structured workouts, days off, let the body recover. Last April, I qualified and ran in the Boston Marathon. 20 years ago, I never would have believed I would have ever been able to run that distance, and I wouldn't have without training. The same applies for writing. Just sitting in a chair pounding on a laptop isn't necessarily productive. Sometimes when I'm working out, I find myself thinking about the novel and seeing things differently, more clearly. A long run can be a great opportunity to try out new dialogue, and now with so many people running around with Bluetooth headsets and talking on their cell phones, nobody even looks at me funny anymore. Here's what Verlin Klinkenberg, who was a rural writer for the New York Times for years, says about writers in his book, Several Short Sentences About Writing. He says, most aspiring writers write too soon. Everything they know about writing, all those images of writers writing, hastens them to their desk, where they sit perched over the keyboard, caught in the anticipatory gesture, eyes intent on the possibility of the screen, poised at the brink of thought, but not actually thinking, as though by leaning forward, a sentence will tip out of their heads and onto the page. Getting published. Let's talk about getting published. The story my niece had commissioned in 2005 evolved over the next 2 years into a 50-year, 300-page epic novel, which I was convinced was ready for huge commercial success. In 2007, I started searching for an agent. I followed the rules and sent out perfect query letter targeting the literary agents who would have the most interest in a multi-generational story of baseball, small-town life, civil rights, and the space program. That covered a lot of agents, but apparently none of them saw it the way I did it, because I can't say for certain because there was no response. I hired an author-editor to read my novel. She said, "Good characters, interesting story, but you skip all the tough scenes." I rewrote it again with more guts.